Oh, hello there. It's OGP, the one giant podcast where, of course, we are your host over here, Adam Armbrecht, also breaking down the Brooklyn Nets and the Locked On Nets podcast with my boy, Doug Norrie. And yonder there is the season generational ticket holder, the healthy, wealthy, and wise Mr. Andrew Makowitz. How are we, sir?
I mean, I've been better, Adam.
Well, you can tell by the tone of the show. This could have been the opening theme music. We chose to go a different direction, keep it classy at the top. But Dane Belton, my friends, we're having a good time. It's the summer. We're feeling good about life. And then OGP, the apple of our eye, the future safety stud alongside Xavier McKinney, goes down with an injury, shows up in a sling almost out of nowhere. And that's the collarbone, my friends. And that is a long road back for one Dane Belton. This one stings, guys. Thinking about closing the windows, thinking about turning off the lights. May wear my sunglasses at night. Where do we go from here, Andy? I mean, we'll break down what it means for the team, but I know, what's so funny is I'm very curious to see how fans in general react about this over the course of camp, because in our minds, as we get away from the sad music.
I know that was pretty, Adam, that was pretty depressing. Like you got me all in my feelings. It felt like it was raining outside and it was dark and I was just staring out into the abyss for a little bit there.
Yeah, listen, but because so it's funny. We're going to talk about the defensive side of the ball first and foremost. A lot of good takeaways. Finally get a little sample size of my favorite player coming out of the draft class, obviously. But Dane Belton going down, like, I wonder how fans are going to react to this. It was actually hard to talk over top of that music because it made me slow down the pacing of my discussion. So you got to work on some things. This is, we're tinkering. We're tinkering in the offseason. How fans are going to respond to this, because for you and me, we saw this as the season, as you work through camp and as the season progresses and underneath Wink Martindale, we really thought that maybe the reason for some optimism and continued growth for this team on the defensive side of the ball was going to be the versatility of what Dane Belton can do for you. And it does kind of remind me of Xavier McKinney in his rookie season, right? Didn't get a lot from him. And then by the time he even got a sniff, it was, well, we hope so. And we know what he was coming out and we know what we think he can be, but we'll have to wait for next season to really get a sample size.
Well, so Adam, all right, let me start with, obviously you mentioned collarbone injury. I immediately thought, well, he is clearly a candidate for the PUP list, the physically unable to perform list. Will probably miss the first 4 weeks. And a couple of other people online felt the same way. And Jordan Renan came out and said, I don't know, he might be ready for week 1. And I went, what? Like, how on earth does that happen? And he basically explained, look, as of yesterday, there was 41 days till week 1 of the season. Mm-hmm. This is usually a 6 to 8 week injury. 41 days puts him right at 6 weeks. So depending on how things go, like, that's the tough part for the Giants. Do you rush him back early and then, have an opportunity to re-break it and then you lose him for the whole season? Or do you use a little bit of an abundance of caution and hold him out for a little bit longer just to say, let's make sure this doesn't linger at all through the season?
Yeah, Dan Dugan, one of the more respected reporters around the New York Football Giants, around the NFL. So he's just giving you a legitimate.
Oh no, that was Jordan Renan.
Jordan Renan. Well, no, okay,
still same.
Equal. Yeah, right. They both fall in the same category, by the way. So good. Just don't mention some other names that we are less affectionate towards. But Jordan Renan saying that, like, yes, the timetable. Okay, he could be back for week 1, but he's not getting reps now, right? He's not getting reps in camp, and this is where I think, to your point, if you're talking about roster moves and trying to feather those first 4 weeks, you're probably going to look at it and say I would say right now in this moment, it's more likely he starts on that PUP list as opposed to not, because you're going to occupy that roster spot going into the regular season, knowing you want to be able to work that gradually. And in the grand scheme of things of where this team is in its rebuild, we don't need to pressure this kid to come in week 1 and be out there on the field making plays. Now, if the recovery progresses and he looks good and he starts to get some practice reps, maybe, 2 weeks out from the start of the regular season, yeah, I think then you start to get that optimism. But in this moment right now, I'm far closer to the depressing music that we were playing at the top, as opposed to being like, listen, better to break it now, right? Break that collarbone now, buddy. Now, listen, earlier is better than later when it comes to the offseason. However,
yeah, you talked about missing reps, but also he's probably going to be missing out on conditioning. Like, I've never broken my collarbone, but like, I'm sure you can't be like full sprint, like running around, because it needs to be able to set. So like, it's going to be tough for him to get his conditioning up. Never mind just making sure the collarbone is set. So that's the tough part for me. What I will say is another piece of silver lining, if there is any, with Dane Belton being out for a little bit, is the Giants were smart in making sure that they signed Andrew Adams, a veteran from the Tampa Bay Buccaneers who has familiarity with the Giants, to come in and be able to play safety. So they have a veteran already sitting behind both Julian Love and Xavier McKinney. So that is a good thing that the Giant fans can at least have a little bit of peace of mind on. The second piece, Adam, is this gives an opportunity for undrafted Yusuf Corker to be able to make the roster week one. If he comes out and he is a thumper and he is a hitter and he says, I am going to play the role that Dane Belton did, now he's going to get more reps in practice to be able to showcase that. Maybe those four are the four guys that you go into week one with, knowing that Dane Belton can come back, week 4, week 5, week 6 of the regular season.
I would have rather seen Yusuf Corker than Adams. Like, I get bringing in the veteran experience, but I think you and I were on the same page of, if you went into the season with and Love and Belton and Corker, like, that was the dream scenario for me. It's a lot of youth. You don't have a ton of experience, but I'm going to rely on Wink Martindale to put these guys in good positions, and hopefully they're able to showcase what their value can be. Understanding that's relying on a lot of later round talent in Belton and then undrafted with Corker. On the defensive side of the ball, though, then overall, when we talk about what's been going on the last couple of days in camp, we got really glowing reviews yesterday from Leonard Williams. Basically took on anybody on the offensive line and shredded them. Again, we're going to talk about the offense a little bit later. I don't know if it's always a good sign when you hear that, because there are some important players that were taking the reps against Leonard Williams, but good to see him doing well. And then we get to maybe the sexiest part of this story, my friends, because finally I get to hear a little something about my boy Darian Beavers getting in some reps.
Yeah, so Darian Beavers, he was making several stops. He was on the first team, Adam. He was out there with the ones for a little bit, which is great. Obviously 6th round pick out of the University of Cincinnati. You were very high on him when he kind of fell in the draft. We didn't really hear much about him during some of the mandatory minicamp stuff. We're starting to hear his name come out. Had a couple tackles for loss. Sounds like he's kind of getting himself acclimated. Don't know if he has the ability to really step in week one, but getting him these valuable reps and seeing what happens in the preseason is going to be important for him.
Oh, 100%. When we're going to talk about the base package now and how it's maybe been affected by that injury as well, to Dane Belton here over the course of training camp and the rest of the summer. But when it comes to a player like Darian Beavers, I think I look at him in a very similar way that we were talking about Ellerson Smith, right? Gosh, the raw talent, what is capable there, the length, the athleticism, being able to kind of come in on sub packages, right? Be a great depth piece, still young, obviously, in Ellerson Smith's case, and then a rookie for Darian Beavers. To your point, do I want to, I'm not trying to put the expectations on either of these players, any of the young players, of like, hey, you better be ready week one to be out there on the field getting max reps. But it's so much better to hear Darian Beavers getting reps with the ones now than it would be to say he got a little look mid-August, right? Because by that point, you're already through the first preseason game, maybe. Yes, he's getting some reps, but that can just be to spell some of the veterans so they don't get burnt out. Like, these guys, young guys getting reps sooner than later means that open competition is legitimate. And we can talk about Tay Crowder, and we can talk about the edge rushers and the outside linebackers and where some of these pieces fit in. So my expectations are, or at least what I want to hear, is more and more, I want to hear that Darian Beavers continues to get mentioned. Doesn't have to always be with the ones, but that you're hearing him making plays. You're hearing him taking strides and coming along.
Well, one of the other guys on the defensive side of the ball, Adam, that has taken his opportunity and run with it is O'Shane Ximenez. And I feel like it's important to talk about him.
I'm not laughing. I'm not. It's the point that we wanted to get to, but we mentioned it yesterday. It's another one. It's another one potentially on Dave Gettleman's on Ledger, right? I mean, God, the guy just set us up so well before he went out the door here. It's funny, man. It's funny how everything looks different through a new coaching staff's lens, and that matters so much. But go on.
But it is crazy too to think Azeez Ojulari hasn't been out there, and so more reps for other people. It kind of goes around, and all of a sudden, O'Shane Ximenez looks awesome in practice. He looks amazing. We were all wondering, where's Ellerson Smith? Where's Quincy Roche? And O'Shane Ximenez is getting the first crack at some of the reps that they were having in practice, and he's been performing admirably. And I think we have both been, after a less than stellar 2021 season for O'Shane Ximenez, and he's even admitted it, saying it really humbled him how poorly he performed or how poorly the team did with him not stepping up. he's looked great. And could you imagine if he ends up being able to carve himself out a role situationally where he can get in there and get after the quarterback? Like that's what we envisioned that he was going to be when he got drafted. And now here we are years later thinking about like what could possibly be under a whole new regime.
And you go and you watch the highlights from him from practice. What I think when you talk about what his impact could be or how he could get utilized, we always said, and same thing with like Lorenzo Carter, a little bit bigger, but a little bit stiffer. So you always got kind of caught in between. Oshane Ximines isn't the biggest player in the world or doesn't have the length that we talk about with a Thibodeau that we're talking about with Ellerson Smith. And I think just the prototypical, what you think about with a guy coming off the edge, you want to see that length and being able to get to the quarterback. But he showed a very quick first step getting around that edge, dipping that shoulder down and being able to get it after the quarterback. I think in a lot of ways, we've talked about this with the previous regime, regardless of moves, anything else, just that expectations that were put on certain players. It's like saying, hey, your skill set is one dimensional and we want you to be three dimensional, right? And that's what I think has been so damning to so many of the holdover players from the previous regime. And we're not going to overstate it around Oshane Ximines or any of these guys. But when you now say, you know what I want you to do, Oshane? This thing. And if you can do that consistently and successfully, then you have a role and you can get reps. And all of a sudden, the waves that Wink Martindale wants to create in his defense as far as putting pressure on opposing offenses, now it's another body. So Ellerson Smith gets put into that group. Oshane Ximines gets put into that group. Quincy Roche hopefully gets put into that group. And when you think back to some of the most successful versions of the New York Football Giants and their defenses, it's about having those packages where you rotate through and you keep bringing consistent pressure. So that's, again, not gonna go, well, that's why O'Shane's deserving of an extension, right? But I think he'll be deserving of reps and being a part of what happens forward. And he's a guy that falls into this group. We'll take this quick step back. We talked about Julian Love. We're talking about Oshane Ximines. There's these guys that we thought from a financial standpoint, we may be talking about being released and creating room depending on what the Giants need to do. I think we're starting to see over minicamp and now training camp that these guys are establishing this is how bad things had been under the previous regime. It got very murky and cloudy about what the skill set was and what these players were capable of.
That is true, Adam. But the big thing about the defensive side of the ball is they have looked far better so far in training camp than the other side of the ball. And we kind of wanted to start with the defense to talk about what we've been seeing and what we've been hearing. But I think it's time we have to pay the piper and talk a little bit about what's been going on in camp on the offensive side of the ball, day one in pads.
Yeah, and just so you know, today, and we'll be touching in on this as the week moves on, no pads today in practice. Dable said going to be going back to those 3rd and 10 scenarios for the offense, putting them in difficult positions and seeing how successful they could be. But yesterday in pads, as you mentioned, let's go ahead. Let's trend positive first here. Let's give everybody a nice little moment here. Tell us about Saquon Barkley and how he's looked.
I mean, every single person has been raving about Leonard Williams on the defensive side of the ball, saying he's just an absolute monster right now. And everyone at camp has been saying Saquon Barkley looks like he is rejuvenated, renaissance, explosive is a word that they're using. They're using him, out of the backfield. They're using him in motion. They're having him catch a bunch of passes. Everyone is saying Saquon Barkley looks like the Saquon Barkley of old, which was a guy at his peak was catching 75, 80, 90 passes out of the backfield, getting almost 2,000 all-purpose yards, was everything for the Giants. Everyone is saying he has that look again in him, Adam. And this is what, you and I have had the kind of differing views on Saquon Barkley going into this season. I've said his value was never lower before. If he comes out and shows that same burst that he had his rookie year and even in year 2, like, man, it changes the complexity and complexion of this Giants offense.
It certainly makes a big impact on the offense. So let's pause on the outlook and what it means for this team and the decision-making process when it came to Saquon Barkley this offseason and going into this year and beyond. And now talk about that offense overall, where again, Feliciano, you mentioned here in our pre-show, yesterday was asked of Brian Dable, will Feliciano be out there on Tuesday? He said, probably, definitely by Wednesday, maybe Tuesday. This morning, confirmed, not out there today. Should be out there tomorrow. But in that, as we talked about yesterday too, it's created the shuffle across the offensive line. We want to get to Daniel Jones in a minute here, but when we heard, as I got excited about Shane Lemieux getting some center reps, I predicted it. within 24 hours, they said reps at center for him. Do you think, even though Feliciano has familiarity at the with Brian Dable going back to Buffalo, do you think that this changes with him being out and hearing Dable say, we want positional versatility? And he mentioned John specifically. He said John at center or at guard, Shane at guard or at center, Izudu, like getting these guys in here and mixing it up so you have positional versatility. Does this open up the idea that maybe this is more of an open competition across the interior of this offensive line than we would have been led to believe with the idea of, well, Feliciano got signed and they're converting to center? Was that maybe more of a good faith gesture for a guy that Dable likes as opposed to concrete, set it and forget it? This is the guy at the top of the depth chart.
This whole time, this whole offseason, I've been thinking the Giants paid a bunch of guaranteed money to John Feliciano to play the starting center position because that's what John Feliciano was telling us. And that's what that we thought that,
right.
He was like, I finally get my chance to be the center that Buffalo didn't let me be under that terrible regime with guys like Brian Dable and Joe Shane there, not letting me flourish.
Dable wasn't just holding me down. I could have done it.
Right. Like I seem to forget this. Like, then I start thinking about the money, Adam. They gave him $2.9 million, basically 2.4 would be his dead cap hit if like they outright released him. I kept thinking it was like binary where he either gets released or he's the starting center. Now with him being out because of heat exhaustion or whatever's going on over the last week and change, it makes me think, would it be that bad to have a swing center / guard making $2.5 million? We've paid $4 or $5 million for swing backup tackles before. So like
we spent more for less, buddy.
Yeah, like so now I'm thinking the $2.5 million shouldn't really be cost prohibitive if we think Feliciano could be a decent backup in a pinch. And we really see that getting Izudu out there early, he has the chops, and Shane Lemieux seems to be taking over the center position. So, like, to me, does that make more sense? I kept thinking it was either Feliciano's here or he's not. But I think you even mentioned that Brian Dable kind of was thinking along the same lines as well.
We talk so much about, what could one injury mean potentially? And now we're seeing that sample with the heat exhaustion and at least getting the sample size that says, well, Bredesen's not going to be any use, right? Like, we're getting samples around the guys that aren't going to work. So now I think you start to build this up and say, what's the best version of it? And at least in the long term, if you start to hear better and better things about Shane Lemieux, that's a positive because he's young and you know that you can have a future with him potentially at guard or center. And then if you hear about Izudu coming along, that I think just starts to open it up, and you have to reward competition. You have to reward who's doing it on the practice field, doing it in the film rooms. And if that's the policy, then John Feliciano is no stronger of a foothold than Shane Lemieux, certainly. And then maybe Izudu as we move through the offseason.
But Adam, didn't you also mention that Brian Dable was talking about people's versatility, and he kind of let it slip about Feliciano as well?
Not just
him playing, right?
Yeah, mentioned it before. Said John at center or at guard, Shane at guard or at center. Like he didn't say Evan Neal at tackle or at center, right? Andrew Thomas at guard, maybe. No, he's mentioned, and nor should you. He's mentioning, and I think it's justifiable and right, anybody other than your bookend guys, and you probably maybe put at least Glowinski to some extent into that category because he's a veteran, he has experience, right? But everything else, you have guards and centers on this roster. Everything happening on the interior from a starter and depth perspective, I think is open. And right now, so far in camp, you'd be more inclined to say, because absence does not always make the heart grow fonder, Shane Lemieux is getting more of a foothold as being, I have a role here wherever it's going to be. Whereas Feliciano, at best, we had to say question mark because we didn't know what we were going to get from him coming in to start with. He's converting over to center. This was a lot. Again, we mentioned it a little bit yesterday. This feels like when Nick Gates moved to center. We were optimistic about it, and then we had to see him prove it. We got a little excited. He suffers the injury. Feliciano has been, a serviceable rotational kind of guy for Buffalo. Like, what's the guarantee that he's going to be a stud center? And at some point, the guys that are getting the reps with Daniel Jones, which we'll move on to here now, that matters. That relationship matters. That development matters. Talent is always going to trump everything else. But if you're good enough, Shane Lemieux, maybe, and who knows, maybe this like little tiny crack of the door open for Nick Gates to get some reps here as well. We expect Feliciano to be back out there tomorrow, and this could all go away over the next week and a half if Feliciano comes and starts to look good. But as it stands right now, different positions on the line are struggling, and you know that this coaching staff is going to be looking for answers as we move along.
Adam, at the end of the day, my friend, we all know that this falls squarely on Daniel Jones' shoulders, right? You hear all the weapons that are out there that are available to him. You hear Saquon Barkley being explosive. You hear that the offensive line is much improved from where it was before.
You better believe it. A little bit of extra sad music there for you on the way out the door. 100%. That's what we're going to find out. And but by the way, though, you said by week 1 against Tennessee Titans, we're going to know. We're going to learn some things here on August 11th against the Patriots. 3 preseason games. I said this before. I think you're going to see more, especially of Daniel Jones in these games, than you normally would in today's NFL from the starting QB position. And if you don't, then there you go. That can be indicative of where this team feels that he is inside the scheme and what they think he's capable of. If you're going to protect him from the injuries, or you're going to say, sorry, he needs the reps, because the only way that we can determine 100% what he is for this franchise is by getting him out there. And if he exposes his weaknesses and opens up the door for a Tyrod Taylor through injury or otherwise at some point this year, that's how you end up moving on as we go forward. But there's so many more positives here overall, I think, in camp so far. A lot of these young players we're talking about. Some of these injuries are creeping up. We'll continue to watch those. We're going to take a look maybe at doing a live here somewhere along this week around these training camp practices as highlights kind of come out throughout the day. Get over to YouTube, though. You like, you subscribe, you share with everyone out there in the world who wants some nice New York Football Giants content. You get the podcast review fulfilled. And as Andy Makowitz want, need, hey, nay, demand people know.
As always, let's go Big Blue.